The North Atlantic, in the centuries we now call the Viking Age, was not a blank space on a map, but a realm of absolute terror and profound mystery. To the learned monks in their scriptoria to the south, huddling against the cold stone of their monasteries, it was Mare Tenebrosum, the sea of darkness, a liquid void at the edge of the known world where monsters stirred and the very laws of God and nature broke down. It was a place where the sun could vanish for months, where fog could swallow a ship whole for weeks, and where the sky and sea merged into a uniform, disorienting grey, stripping sailors of all sense of direction and leaving them to drift in a featureless prison until the sea claimed them. Yet, across this same treacherous expanse, the Norse did not merely venture. They voyaged with a purposeful audacity that defies comprehension. They found and settled the isolated Faroe Islands. They pushed west to the colossal ice cliffs of Greenland, and ultimately, around the turn of the first millennium, they made landfall on the shores of a continent they called Vinland, a place we know as North America. Theirs were not accidents of drift, desperate survivors clinging to wreckage. These were deliberate, repeatable journeys across thousands of nautical miles of the most hostile ocean on the planet, undertaken in open longships with a shallow draft utterly unsuited to blue water sailing. The question that has echoed through a millennium of history, whispered in academic halls, and pondered by every modern sailor who has faced the North Atlantic's fury, is a deceptively simple one. How? The answer lies not in any single tool or tactic, but in a sublime synthesis of observation, intuition, and a technology so elegantly simple, yet so effective that it borders on myth. It was a system of wayfinding that turned the sea itself into a signpost and the sky into a chart. A system where the flight of a bird, the drift of cloud, the taste of a breeze, and the behavior of a whale could all speak volumes. And at the heart of this system, according to the sagas and a growing body of compelling scientific evidence, was an object of seemingly magical property, the solarsteinn, the Sunstone. This was not a tool of last resort, but a key component in a navigator's arsenal, a crystalline compass that could point to a hidden sun, cutting through the veil of cloud and fog that doomed other sailors. To understand its power, we must first step away from our modern maps and GPS and immerse ourselves in the worldview of the Norse sailor, for whom navigation was not a science of coordinates, but an art of reading a living, breathing world. The Viking ship, that iconic silhouette of sheer terror for coastal Europe, was in its oceanic form a masterpiece of paradoxical design. The Nar, the workhorse of exploration and trade, was broader and deeper than the raiding longship, built to carry cargo, livestock, and families. Yet it remained essentially an open boat, its crew exposed to the elements, bailing constantly, with no shelter from the biting wind or the towering waves that could rise like moving mountains. There was no cabin to retreat to, no sealed helm from which to command. The navigator stood or sat amidships, exposed, feeling every shift of the hull, every change in the wind's cadence on his skin. His tools were not of brass and glass, but of perception and deep-coded knowledge passed down through generations. He practiced what we now call cognitive wayfinding, building a mental map from a relentless stream of sensory input. He watched the migratory paths of birds like the Atlantic puffin or the northern gannet, knowing certain species would fly directly toward land at dusk. He learned to interpret ocean swells, the great rolling waves generated by prevailing winds, feeling through the ship's timbers how their direction shifted, telling him if he was being pushed off course. He tasted the air for the scent of land of peat smoke, of pine forests, or of the distinct dense odor of coastal seaweed. He listened to the sea itself, the sound of waves breaking differently on a shoreline versus open water, or the sudden cacophony of a seabird colony carried on the wind. He observed the whales, whose feeding grounds often lay along specific underwater topography leading towards shallows. All this information was integrated into a continuously updated mental model of his position, a model that was frustratingly imprecise by our standards, but was, for its time, staggeringly effective. It was a method born of intimate familiarity, a deep dialogue between the sailor and his environment. But this sensory method had one critical, glaring weakness. It depended utterly on a clear view of the sky. The sun was the primary clock and compass. By day, its arc gave east and west. By noting its height at noon, a skilled observer could estimate latitude. At night, in the high latitudes where the pole star, Leiðarstjörna, or guiding star, wheeled high in the heavens, it provided a relatively fixed northern point. But what happened when the Skijjarnir, the clouds, drew their shroud across the sky for days on end, or when the Fjoka, the fog, erased the horizon, blending sea and air into a formless grey milk? This was the navigator's nightmare, the condition that could lead to the hafilla, the sea bewilderment, a state of utter directional confusion where men could sail in circles until madness or thirst took them. It was in this desperate, sightless void that the Sunstone was said to work its magic. The Sunstone enters the historical record not in navigational manuals, for the Vikings left none, but woven into the rich tapestry of their sagas, those epic narratives of kings, heroes, and everyday life. The most famous reference comes from the Ráðhús Chut, a 13th century tale that, while written down later, preserves older oral traditions. In it, the legendary king Olaf Haraldsson tests the observational skills of a man named Sigurður. The king asks him to locate the sun on a completely overcast day. Sigurður looks skyward, sees nothing but uniform cloud, then produces a mysterious solarsteinn. He holds it aloft, peers through it, and by rotating the stone, he is able to pinpoint the hidden sun's location with uncanny accuracy, astounding the king and his court. This is not presented as sorcery, but as a skilled man using a known tool. Another saga, that of Saint Olaf, describes a similar episode where the sun is found, though the weather was thick and snowy. For centuries, these accounts were dismissed as mere literary fancy, a metaphor for divine guidance or innate wisdom. The idea of a stone that could see the sun through solid cloud seemed firmly in the realm of fantasy. But in the 20th century, as scholars began to take the pragmatic genius of Norse navigation more seriously, a question arose. Could there be a physical, mineralogical basis for this legend? The search for the real Sunstone began not in a historian's library, but in a geologist's laboratory, and it would lead to one of the most captivating intersections of archaeology, physics, and ancient ingenuity. The key to unlocking the Sunstone's secret lay in understanding a property of light that is invisible to the human eye, but perceptible through certain crystals: polarization. Sunlight, as it scatters through the Earth's atmosphere, becomes polarized, meaning its light waves vibrate in a specific orientation rather than randomly. This polarization forms a consistent pattern across the dome of the sky, centered on the sun itself, even when the sun is obscured by cloud or fog. Our eyes cannot detect this pattern, but some animals, like bees and certain species of birds, can and do use it for navigation. The breakthrough in understanding the Sunstone came when researchers realized that certain transparent crystals, notably calcite, Iceland spar, cordiorite, and tourmaline, are dichroic. This means they filter light based on its polarization. When you look through a clear chunk of Iceland spar, you see a double image due to its property of double refraction. But more importantly, as you rotate the crystal, one of these images will appear brighter and the other darker depending on the polarization angle of the light entering it. In theory, a navigator could hold such a stone up to the sky, even a uniformly grey, overcast sky, and rotate it slowly. At the point where the two images achieve equal brightness, or where one image achieves maximum contrast, the crystal's orientation reveals the axis of polarization, and thus the hidden position of the sun. It would not give a pinpoint location, but it would reveal a bearing along the solar meridian, a line running north-south through the sun's position. For a navigator lost in a haze, knowing just this single line, knowing that the sun was there, along that axis could be enough to re-establish his mental map, to recall the sun's approximate morning or afternoon arc, and to correct his course. It was a way of pulling a single, crucial thread from the tangled weave of the obscured sky. The plausibility of this theory was dramatically bolstered by a remarkable archaeological find in 2002. Off the coast of Alderney in the English Channel, the wreck of an Elizabethan warship from the late 16th century was discovered. Among the cannons and debris lay a curious, rectangular white block. Analysis confirmed it was a large, high-quality piece of Iceland spar, calcite, meticulously shaped and polished. This ship sank centuries after the Viking Age, but its location in the Channel, a major shipping lane, and the care taken in fashioning the crystal strongly suggested it was a dedicated navigational tool. Here was tangible, physical evidence that the principle of the Sunstone was not just a Norse legend, but a technology that persisted in European seafaring long after the Viking Age had faded into history. The Alderney crystal proved that someone, somewhere, was using these optical properties to navigate. If Elizabethan sailors were using it, it stands to reason the knowledge was older, possibly passed down or rediscovered from an ancient tradition. This find shifted the Sunstone from the realm of speculative theory into the realm of historical probability. The Vikings, with their extensive trade networks reaching deep into the Arctic and across the Baltic, would have had access to these minerals. Iceland spar, as its name implies, is found in abundance in Iceland, a major Norse colony. Cordierite is found in Norway and Sweden. The raw materials were literally under their feet. The leap from possessing the crystal to understanding its navigational application is significant, but not unimaginable for a culture whose survival depended on reading subtle environmental cues. A curious navigator, playing with a clear stone on a partially cloudy day, might have noticed the changing brightness of the images and made the connection. Knowledge so vital would have been guarded, passed from master navigator to apprentice, a secret as valuable as the finest sword. To see the Sunstone in its true context, we must resist the modern temptation to view it as a standalone gadget, a Viking GPS unit. This profoundly misunderstands its role. It was not a magic bullet that solved all navigational problems. Rather, it was a specialized tool for a specific, critical crisis, the loss of the celestial horizon. Its value was not in constant use, but in its ability to break the deadlock of Havla when all other methods failed. Imagine a Nar, 3 days out from the coast of Greenland, the destination a thin sliver of habitable land amidst a wilderness of ice. The fog closes in, dense and enduring, the swell becomes confused, its direction masked by local wind chop. No birds are seen, the air smells only of damp salt. For a day, the navigator relies on dead reckoning, estimating speed and direction from the feel of the wind and the wake. But currents are unpredictable, and error compounds with every hour. A sense of dread begins to creep in. This is the moment the Sunstone would be retrieved, perhaps from a small, oiled leather pouch. The navigator, perhaps the ship's master or a dedicated Leitzagumather, pathfinder, would stand steadily on the heaving deck. He would hold the crystal up, not directly toward where he guessed the sun might be, but toward the zenith, the patch of sky most likely to show the clearest polarization pattern. He would rotate it slowly, his experienced eye focused on the twin images within the stone's depth, watching for that telltale shift in luminosity. It would require patience and a practiced touch, filtering out the random glare off the water, waiting for a consistent reading. And then he would see it a line of symmetry, an axis of brightness. The sun lies there, he might say, pointing along the line. It was not a precise fix, but it was a lifeline. That single bearing, cross-referenced with his memory of the time of day and the season, would tell him if he was north or south of his intended latitude, if he was pointing toward the ice or the open ocean. It would give him the confidence to hold his course or make a crucial correction. It turned a potentially fatal period of blindness into a manageable delay. The true genius of Norse navigation, therefore, was its holistic, layered redundancy. It was a system with multiple fallbacks. If you lost the sun, you had the stars. If you lost the stars, you read the swells and watch the birds. If you lost all visual references, you had the Sunstone to find the sun you could not see. And underpinning it all was a profound oral tradition, a cognitive map of the North Atlantic that was sung, chanted, and remembered. This tradition is glimpsed in another tantalizing medieval source, the Norse sailing directions for the route from Bergen in Norway to the southern tip of Greenland. These are not charts, but verbal lists of landmarks, distances, and headings. They speak in a language of practical experience. Sail north from Hernum until you reach the latitude of Shetland, but so far out that you can only just see it in clear weather when standing at the masthead. They describe using the midday sky and the height of the sun. Most intriguingly, they reference something called a solskuggafjol, a sun's shadow board. This is believed to have been a primitive but effective latitude measurer, a wooden disc with a central gnomon that cast a shadow. The length of the shadow at local noon would tell the sailor how far north he was. The sailing directions, the sun shadow board, and the Sunstone represent different components of an integrated system. The directions provided the macro route, the shadow board provided a latitudinal check in fair weather, and the Sunstone provided a celestial reference in foul weather. Together, they formed a robust methodology for open ocean travel. This system did not emerge fully formed. It was the hard-won product of centuries of incremental expansion, of disaster and discovery. The settlement of Iceland in the 9th century was a massive navigational leap, requiring ships to stay at sea for a week or more out of sight of land. Each successful voyage added to the collective knowledge, each shipmaster adding his own observations about currents, bird life, and weather signs. The push to Greenland in the 980 seconds by Eric the Red was an even more audacious feat, a 1,800 nautical mile crossing of the Labrador Sea, one of the most storm-ridden and iceberg-plagued stretches of water in the world. To attempt this without some reliable method of finding direction in the frequent fogs would have been suicidal. The subsequent voyages to Vinland, to the coasts of what are now Newfoundland and Labrador, speak to a confidence in wayfinding that borders on the routine. The sagas describe these voyages matter-of-factly, with greater drama reserved for the encounters with the indigenous Skrallings than for the navigation itself. The implication is clear. By the year 1000, crossing the North Atlantic was a known, if dangerous, art. The sea was not a barrier to the Norse, it was a highway, but a highway that demanded the highest toll of skill and courage from its travelers. The Sunstone was one of the tools that made paying that toll possible. The voyage to Vinland, as chronicled in the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, stands as the ultimate testament to this navigational system's capabilities. It was not a single desperate punt into the unknown, but a series of planned expeditions involving multiple ships, families, livestock, and the clear intent to establish a lasting settlement. The saga accounts, while embroidered with drama and dialogue, provide a plausible skeleton of the route. It began with a deliberate departure from known coordinates. The navigators did not simply sail west from Greenland and hope for the best. They used Greenland's distinctive western landmarks, perhaps the towering ice cap itself, or specific fjords as a baseline. From there, the sagas suggest they sailed a deliberate latitude, a technique known as running down a parallel. This involved using the sun shadow board or noon sun observation to maintain a specific north-south position, then turning to hold a steady course due west. This method, while crude, would eventually strike a continent. The brilliance of it lay in its simplicity and its reliance on a single, measurable factor, the sun's altitude. They were essentially following a celestial line drawn across the ocean, but maintaining that line for weeks through variable winds and currents required constant correction. The Sunstone's role on such a voyage would have been intermittent but critical. The Grand Banks off Newfoundland are infamous for dense, persistent fog generated by the clash of the cold Labrador Current and the warm Gulf Stream. A ship could easily miss the landmark of, say, the distinctive Further Strandir or Wonder Strands described in the sagas if it was merely a few miles off course in such conditions. A navigator, sensing the temperature drop and the muffling blanket of fog descend, could use the Sunstone to take a bearing. Even if he could not see the sun, knowing its bearing would tell him if the wind or current was pushing him north or south of his intended westbound line. He could then adjust, fighting to stay on that invisible highway in the sea. The Vinland voyages ultimately failed as a colonization effort, but their navigational success was undeniable. Men like Leif Erikson, Thorvald Eriksson, and Thorfinn Karlsefni made the round trip, demonstrating that the ocean crossing was a repeatable feat. Their failure was political and social, clashing with a numerous and resistant indigenous population and suffering from the immense logistical strain of supporting a remote colony from a Greenlandic base that was itself on the ecological edge. The navigation, however, had proven itself. The knowledge of how to get there and back was preserved, even if the will to sustain the venture was not. This leads to a profound and often overlooked dimension of Viking navigation. It was not merely a technical skill, but a form of deep ecological literacy, a knowledge system embedded in the cultural memory of the community. The navigator was not a technician with instruments, he was a custodian of lore. His knowledge was sung in drapa, poems, encoded in kennings, metaphorical phrases, and passed down through generations. The names they gave to places were often navigational aids in themselves. Kilanes, keel point, might indicate a place where a ship's keel was repaired. Havarth, vanishing point, denoted a headland where a coastline dramatically disappeared from a certain angle, a crucial marker. The sailing directions themselves were rhythmic, mnemonic. This oral transmission was fragile, yet it persisted for centuries because it was vital to survival. It meant that a navigator setting out from Iceland in the 13th century was likely following a mental map refined and validated by generations of sailors stretching back to the 9th. The Sunstone as a physical object would have been part of this tradition. Its use, its limitations, and the rituals surrounding its handling, perhaps it was never to be touched by unclean hands, or was stored in a special place, would have been part of the master's teaching to the apprentice. The loss of this holistic knowledge system was gradual. It began with the adoption of Christianity and the slow shift from an oral to a written culture, which changed how knowledge was stored and valued. It accelerated with the political centralization of Scandinavian kingdoms and the decline of the independent seagoing chieftain. But the most direct cause was the adoption of new technology from the south, the magnetic compass. The magnetic compass, likely arriving in European waters from China via the Arab world and the Mediterranean in the 12th or 13th centuries, represented a paradigm shift. It was a tool that gave a direction regardless of weather, time of day, or visibility. It did not require deep ecological knowledge or years of experience to interpret. It pointed north, consistently and mysteriously. For sailors accustomed to the nuanced, demanding art of celestial wayfinding, it must have seemed like a kind of sorcery at first, but a sorcery that was far easier to master. The compass democratized navigation. It lowered the barrier to entry, allowing merchants and sailors who were not heirs to generations of Norse pathfinding lore to undertake longer voyages. It was perfectly suited to the rising mercantile states of the Hanseatic League and the kingdoms of the late medieval period, who valued standardization and reliability. The old ways, with their reliance on personal skill, memory, and environmental intimacy, began to atrophy. The Sunstone, the Sun Shadow Board, the detailed knowledge of bird migrations and whale paths, these became the specialized knowledge of old men, then curiosities, then legends. The last vestiges of the Norse system likely persisted in the remote fjords of Iceland and Greenland for a time, but as the Greenland settlements faded into silence in the 15th century, a vast repository of practical Arctic and Atlantic knowledge vanished with them. The compass and the subsequent development of the marine chart created a new, abstracted relationship with the sea. The ocean became a space to be plotted, a grid to be crossed, rather than a living entity to be read and listened to. The Viking art of wayfinding was not so much forgotten as rendered obsolete by a simpler, less demanding technology. Yet, the story of the Sunstone does not end with its obsolescence. It experienced a remarkable resurrection in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, moving from saga myth to scientific hypothesis to a demonstrated, plausible technology. This modern rediscovery began with the work of Danish archaeologist Thorkild Ramsku in the 1960s, who first seriously proposed the polarization theory, but it was advanced significantly by interdisciplinary teams, combining historians, physicists, and even practicing sailors. Laboratory experiments proved the optical principle conclusively. Calcite crystals could indeed determine the sun's position under cloud cover with a degree of accuracy useful for navigation. The pivotal moment came when researchers moved from the lab to the field and eventually to the sea. In 2011, a team led by French optical physicist Guy Ropars conducted a landmark study. Using a calibrated piece of Iceland spar identical to the Alderney crystal, they demonstrated that even novice users could locate the sun's position in overcast conditions within a few degrees of accuracy. The experiment was compelling, but it was still conducted on land. The true test was the chaotic, moving environment of a ship at sea. This test was undertaken by a different group, embodying the very spirit of the Vikings they were studying, experimental archaeologists and adventurous sailors. They built and sailed replicas of Viking ships, like the Saga Sigla and the Gaia, across the North Atlantic, deliberately using only period-appropriate navigation methods. While such voyages are, by necessity, shadowed by modern safety vessels, the crews committed to relying on their reconstructed tools and knowledge. Reports from these expeditions speak to the profound challenge of the enterprise. The sun shadow board works, but requires a steady hand and a visible sun. Reading swirls is an art that takes years to master, and the Sunstone, in practice, is described as a fickle friend. It is not a tool that gives an instant, digital readout. On a heaving deck, with spray in the air and the light conditions changing by the second, achieving a clear reading from the crystal requires immense patience and a degree of luck. The modern sailors confirmed its feasibility but also its limitations. It is a tool for resolving ambiguity, not for providing constant guidance. It works best in stable, thick overcast, not in patchy, moving clouds or in the haze just above the horizon. This real-world testing added a crucial layer of grit and realism to the elegant laboratory theory. It showed that the Sunstone was not a magic wand, but a last-ditch optical aid for a supremely skilled navigator who already knew, in his bones, approximately where he was and what the sky should be doing. Its value was in confirming a suspicion, in breaking a deadlock, not in providing primary guidance. This nuanced understanding ultimately makes the Viking achievement more impressive, not less. It removes the crutch of imagined magical technology and reveals their true tool, a cultivated, holistic human intelligence applied relentlessly to the problem of survival on the open ocean. The legacy of the Viking Sunstone and the wayfinding system it supported extends far beyond the historical curiosity of how a specific people crossed a specific ocean. It forces a fundamental re-evaluation of pre-modern human capability, challenging the persistent notion that without complex instruments, long-distance ocean travel was a matter of chance or foolhardy bravery. The Norse accomplishment demonstrates a different paradigm of knowledge, one that is somatic, embedded, and deeply integrated with the natural world. Their navigation was not a proto-science striving for abstract precision, but a high art of pragmatic interpretation, where the human body itself, the feel of the swell through the deck, the taste of the air, the eye discerning subtle shifts in watercolor or cloud formation was the primary instrument. The Sunstone was an extension of that bodily perception, a technological lens that amplified a hidden signal in the world, much like a hearing aid amplifies sound. This stands in stark contrast to the later European model of navigation, which sought to remove the subjective human element through the objective measurements of the compass, the astrolabe, and eventually the chronometer. The Viking method was additive and contextual. The later method was reductive and universal. One was a dialogue with the environment, the other a monologue of coordinates imposed upon it. Understanding this distinction is crucial, for it helps explain not only how the Vikings achieved their voyages, but also why their specific methods faded into obscurity. They were not outcompeted by a superior technology in a direct sense. Rather, the entire cultural and economic framework that produced and sustained their unique form of literacy was eclipsed by a world moving towards standardization and abstraction. This eclipse can be seen most poignantly in the fate of the Greenland Norse settlements. For nearly 5 centuries, these communities thrived on the very edge of the habitable world, their existence utterly dependent on the maritime lifeline to Iceland and Europe. They hunted walrus for ivory, herded sheep, and traded goods across the sea. Their navigators were the linchpins of society, the men who maintained the connection to the wider Norse world and its essential supplies of iron, timber, and prestige goods. The sailing directions between the Greenland settlements, the eastern and western settlements, and the hunting grounds of the Norðursetur, the northern hunting grounds, would have been part of this intimate local knowledge passed down within families. As the Little Ice Age intensified in the 13th and 14th centuries, making the climate colder and the sea ice more prevalent and treacherous, the role of the navigator would have become even more critical, and the conditions under which the Sunstone was useful, fog generated by ice meeting warmer water, would have become more common. Yet, the very environmental changes that made their skills more necessary also conspired to isolate them. Increased ice in the Denmark Strait made the passage to Iceland more dangerous and less frequent. The economic basis of their society, the walrus ivory trade, collapsed as cheaper elephant ivory from Africa flooded European markets via new trade routes. The settlements shrunk, became more insular, and their contact with the knowledge centers of Scandinavia attenuated. The last recorded ship from Norway arrived in Greenland in the early 15th century. After that, silence. The navigational knowledge, so specific to the North Atlantic and so dependent on a vibrant, practicing community of sailors, likely atrophied within a generation or two in the dying settlements. By the time European ships returned to Greenland in the late 16th century, they found only ruins and a memory among the Inuit of a people who had gone away. The Sunstone lore, along with the ability to build a true ocean-going Nar and the detailed mental charts of the ocean, vanished not with a bang, but with the quiet extinction of the last elder who remembered the old ways. The modern fascination with the Sunstone, therefore, taps into something deeper than solving a historical puzzle. It represents a yearning to recover a lost form of human-environment interaction, a hands-on wisdom that seems profoundly alien in our GPS-saturated world. We live in an age of navigational certainty, We can know our position on the planet to within a few meters, in real time, with a device in our pocket. This is a staggering technological triumph, but it has also induced a kind of sensory amnesia. We have largely lost the ability to orient ourselves by the sun, the stars, or the landscape. The Viking navigator's world was one of profound uncertainty mitigated by deep attentiveness. Every clue from the environment was weighted, interpreted, and woven into a narrative of position and progress. His journey was a continuous story he was deciphering, not a dotted line on a screen. The Sunstone's modern rediscovery serves as a powerful metaphor for this lost attentiveness. It is a reminder that the world still broadcasts signals we have forgotten how to receive, that there are layers of reality like the polarization of sunlight that are invisible to our unaided senses but were perceptible to those who knew how to look. This is perhaps why the Sunstone has captured the imagination of scientists, historians, and the public alike. It is a tangible, elegant bridge between a mythical past and a demonstrable physical principle, between the romantic vision of the fearless Viking explorer and the pragmatic reality of a skilled craftsman, using the tools at his disposal to solve an existential problem. The final chapter in the Sunstone story is still being written, not in the sagas or on the open ocean, but in the domain of materials, science, and archaeology. The discovery of the Alderney crystal provided the first concrete evidence, but it is an outlier. The search continues for a sunstone in a definitively Viking context, perhaps in a chieftain's grave, sealed in a workshop, or even lost in the ballast of a wrecked Nar. The acidic soils of Scandinavia are unkind to organic materials, but a crystal like Iceland's spar can endure. Finding one would be an archaeological sensation, a direct material link to the legend. In the absence of such a definitive find, researchers turn to more subtle forms of evidence. Trace element analysis of calcite pieces found at Norse sites could potentially be matched to known geological sources in Iceland or Norway. Experimental archaeology continues to refine our understanding of the practicalities. How large did the stone need to be? Was it shaped or used in the raw? Was it mounted in a wooden frame to aid rotation, or simply held in the hand? Each voyage in a replica ship yields new data on the human factors, the fatigue, the difficulty of maintaining concentration in a storm, the moments of clarity when the tool suddenly works. Furthermore, studies in animal navigation have provided fascinating parallels. The discovery that certain birds, like the zebra finch, possess proteins in their eyes that are magnetoreceptive, and that other species are sensitive to polarized light, suggests that the Vikings were, in a sense, harnessing a sensory modality used by other long-distance travelers in the animal kingdom. They were creating a technology to emulate and augment a natural compass. This line of inquiry blurs the line between instinct and learned skill, suggesting that the Norse system was a sophisticated cultural adaptation that plugged into fundamental environmental constants also used by non-human migrators. In the end, the Viking Sunstone is more than a clever mineral trick. It is the centerpiece of a story about human ingenuity in the face of the sublime and terrifying indifference of the sea. It represents a point where myth meets physics, where oral tradition encoded practical mathematics, and where a culture's boldest ambitions were enabled by its most attentive observations. The Norse did not conquer the North Atlantic because they had a magic stone. They succeeded because they built a robust, multi-layered system of wayfinding, of which the Sunstone was a crucial, crisis-solving component. Theirs was a world without margins for error, where a mistake in judgment could mean death not just for an individual, but for an entire ship's company and the families waiting for them. The pressure of that reality forged a methodology that was both brilliantly simple and deeply complex. It was an art form as much as a science, a song of the sea passed from one generation to the next. The Sunstone's light, hidden within its crystalline structure, was a faint but steady beacon in that long night of fog and doubt, a whisper from the hidden sun guiding them toward the next shore, the next homestead, the next chapter in the relentless human story of exploration. Its rediscovery today does not diminish their achievement by making it seem technological. It elevates it by revealing the profound depth of understanding and adaptation that their technology represented. They were not just warriors in longships, they were the master readers of a world we have only begun to learn how to see again. The implications of this recovered knowledge stretch into the present, inviting us to reconsider not only the past but also our relationship with technology and the natural world today. The Viking navigators' reliance on a distributed system of cues, celestial, oceanic, avian, and mineral, stands as a powerful model of resilience. In an age where a single point of failure, such as a satellite network disruption, could cripple global navigation, their methodology offers a lesson in redundancy born of necessity. It was a system without a single point of failure. If one cue was absent, another could be sought. This ecological redundancy is a principle modern systems engineers now strive to emulate in critical infrastructure. The Norse, by virtue of their precarious position on the edge of the known world, had engineered a form of biological and environmental resilience into their very means of movement. Their technology stack was not a series of isolated gadgets, but an integrated network of observations, where the Sunstone served as a specialized node for extracting information when the primary nodes, the visible sun and stars, went offline. This holistic approach is a stark contrast to the brittle efficiency of many modern systems, a reminder that robustness often lies in diversity of information and method. This perspective also reframes the broader narrative of the Viking Age itself. Traditionally portrayed as an era of rapacious raiding, the image is one of sudden, shocking violence from the sea. While true on one level, this focus obscures the profound logistical and intellectual achievement that made the raids possible. The ability to traverse open ocean with purpose was the foundational skill that enabled everything else. The raids on Lindisfarne and Paris, the trade journeys to Constantinople and Baghdad, the settlement of Iceland and Greenland, and the exploration of Vinland. The raider, the trader, the explorer, and the settler were all, first and foremost, master mariners. Their ships were their defining technology, but the knowledge to guide those ships across trackless waters was their supreme intellectual capital. A monastic chronicler, seeing a dragon-proud longship emerge from the dawn mist, saw only an agent of chaos. He did not see the generations of accrued wayfinding lore, the keen observation of weather patterns, the mental chart of currents, and the practiced hand holding a sunstone up to a grey sky that had brought that ship to that precise beach at that precise time. The violence was the headline. The navigation was the decades-long research and development project that made the headline possible. Recognizing the Sunstone's role pulls back the curtain on this backstage reality. It forces us to see the Vikings not as primitive forces of nature, but as sophisticated practitioners of environmental science, their brutality matched by their ingenuity, their capacity for destruction enabled by a deep, cultivated understanding of the natural world. Furthermore, the Sunstone saga illuminates the complex, non-linear path of technological progress. It is not a simple story of primitive tools being replaced by better ones. The magnetic compass was, in many objective ways, a better tool for finding north. It was simpler, more reliable in a wider range of conditions, and required less esoteric knowledge to use. Its adoption was therefore inevitable in a globalizing medieval economy. Yet, in that transition, a vast body of nuanced, place-specific knowledge, the very kind that allowed for the settlement of the most extreme environments of the North Atlantic, was rendered obsolete and ultimately lost. This is a recurring pattern in technological history, the superseding of a complex, adaptive local skill set by a simpler, more universal, and more easily disseminated technology. The gains in accessibility and standardization are often accompanied by a loss of depth, of granular intimacy with specific ecosystems. The Viking wayfinding system was peak performance for a specific environment, the cloud-shrouded, island-dotted North Atlantic. The compass was good enough performance for all the world's oceans. The trade-off is clear. The story of the Sunstone, therefore, is also a cautionary tale about the fragility of specialized knowledge and how easily the libraries of the mind, unwritten and passed through practice, can vanish when the economic or cultural imperative to maintain them disappears. Today, the spirit of the late Sogamatha finds new expression in unlikely places. Modern long-distance sailors who shun electronic aids, practicing celestial navigation with sextant and chronometer, are the philosophical descendants of the Norse pathfinders, though their tools are more precise. More compellingly, the scientific principles behind the Sunstone have inspired cutting-edge research. The study of polarization optics, partly motivated by this historical puzzle, has applications in modern technology, from improving LCD screens to developing new forms of remote sensing. Some researchers are even exploring bio-inspired navigation systems for autonomous drones and underwater vehicles, systems that would use polarized light sensors, much like the Sunstone and Eye, for orientation without relying on GPS. In a curious full circle, the ancient solution to a problem of foggy seas might inform the development of robots exploring the cloudy atmospheres of other planets or the lightless depths of Earth's oceans. The Viking Sunstone, born of necessity and keen observation, has become a touchstone for interdisciplinary thinking, connecting archaeology to physics, history to robotics, and ancient poetry to future engineering. Ultimately, the enduring power of the Sunstone lies in its elegant resolution of a fundamental human anxiety, the fear of being lost. For the Norse, lost at sea was not a metaphor but an immediate prelude to death. The Sunstone was a psychological tool as much as a navigational one. In the disorienting void of the Hafvilla, it provided a fixed point in a formless universe, a shred of objective data in a subjective nightmare. It restored agency. The act of taking the stone out, of performing the ritual of rotation and observation, was in itself a defiance of despair, a reaffirmation of the navigator's craft and his connection to the hidden order of the cosmos. This symbolic weight transcends its specific historical context. It speaks to the universal human quest for orientation, for finding our place when all landmarks have vanished. Whether that disorientation is physical, spiritual, or intellectual, the human response has always been to seek patterns, to use whatever tools are at our disposal, be they crystals, compasses, equations, or stories to infer direction from chaos. The voyages of the Norse across the North Atlantic, guided by sun, stone, and saga, stand as one of humanity's great odysseys. They were not the first to cross oceans. The Polynesians achieved feats of wayfinding that dwarf them in scope, but they did so in one of the most punishing maritime environments on Earth, with a technology that seems, to modern eyes, heartbreakingly frail. The Sunstone is the key that unlocks the logic of their impossibility. It transforms their story from one of mythic luck to one of demonstrable skill. It shows us a people who looked at a seemingly featureless, hostile sea and learned to read its hidden text, who held a piece of clear rock to a gloomy sky and found a path when none could be seen. In recovering their method, we do more than solve a 1,000-year-old riddle. We recover a fragment of a different human relationship with the world, one of deep dialogue and acute attention, a reminder that the most advanced technology is sometimes not the one that replaces our senses, but the one that refines and extends them, allowing us to listen more closely to the whispers of the world.